The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're gonna love it.
Okay, let's go.
Well, I had to bring you back because today is vindication day for you because, well, not even vindication, but you were like Nostradamus relatively a year ago, predicting kind of what was going to happen in Russia and Ukraine. He is back. Professor Demetrius Floudas, my esteemed intellectual professor is back, and welcome back to Deep Shallow Dive. And honestly, let's really jump in and let's start off with where things are in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war from your perspective, and quite frankly, why the tremendous shift in U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine, and obviously, especially the Trump administration. And I want you to talk about how, Greenland, I want you to talk about Mexico, I want you to talk about Canada, I want you to talk about the tariffs, and let's sort of talk about how all of those things are really influencing the decision Trump's made about Ukraine. And then if we have time at the end, we'll talk about why Israel is not influencing that. Welcome back.
It is great to be back with you, Ray, and I am very happy that we're going to have another discussion. Of course, you say that it is vindication for me, and I do not want to appear too sanctimonious about this because that puts people off. More than Nostradamus, I have been a Cassandra, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I was one of the few who was coming up with a number of ideas that were going against the grain last year. And it seems that I was not too far off the mark for some of them, at least. I had also predicted, although definitely I was not the only one doing that the war would end in 2025. And this seems to be happening as well.
Okay. All right. So why do you think it's happening? Let's talk about Trump. Let's talk about the Trump administration. First of all, we're about 60 days in, and I've been very critical of what I've seen, and I've admitted this to my audience, so I don't know, I'll admit it to you in case you don't know. I did vote for Trump. I did support him in this election. I supported him in 2020. I did not support him in 2016, but I wasn't into any of this stuff in 2016. And I will say, I'm seeing a very different Trump in 2025 than 2016. But start with your maybe overall assessment of how you think his administration is doing so far.
Well, I will start with Ukraine.
Okay.
My premise last year was actually that the Ukraine conflict was constructed in the United States. And what we're seeing now is that it's being deconstructed right there. Against the accepted wisdom of the last 3 years, the Ukraine conflict was not caused by Russia. Obviously, the invasion was Russian, but it was not unprovoked. It was very much provoked. And I'm happy to hear that many other analysts that were also trying to say that, but were not given either the space or the forum to do so, are now coming back and saying, well, again, this is what it was. And because we can see now what difference has been made simply because the US has changed policy, has changed tack, and that was all it needed. Just imagine how it would have been if the United States government had acted in a different way back then, 3 years ago. Let's not forget that the Biden policies were nothing about Ukraine, without Ukraine, and with Kiev until the very end, trying to isolate Russia and, in fact, try to put into operation that famous RAND report of 2019, which was advocating for causing and instigating a conflict between Russia and Ukraine in order to weaken the former.
Yeah.
So what we have now is
That RAND report, by the way, that's one of probably the most important yet most unseen reports ever, because it's almost like they're laying out the plans and they're laying out the regime change plans. We've talked a lot on this show about, United States covert regime change, whether that's in Libya, whether that's in Syria, whether that's in Iraq, whether that's in Somalia, Sudan, whatever. But that RAND report really is almost like, hey, everybody, this is what we think is the best thing to happen. And it really is amazing that it's still available online, but nobody looks at it. Let me ask you this: in terms of the Biden administration, why did they do this? Was it all just obviously to weaken Russia and have a proxy war? But then, you saw maybe a month ago, Zelensky did some interviews where he said, "Hey, I've only received $75 billion from the United States." And then on the United States side, it's stated that we've sent over 200 billion. So the question becomes, what happened to that 125 billion? Do you think this was, I don't know, a money laundering situation or corruption in that regard?
not corruption for 125 billion. That's a bit too much. That's definitely not. Might have been bits and pieces there, but in the millions, not the billions. What the discrepancy appears to reflect is pure hard military aid as opposed to other kind of monies, which may be support for the budget of certain ministries, support for payments of the civil servants and that kind of thing. Also extremely important, but it may be that this is it. Now, in my calculations, and mine are not any much better than anyone else's, the best calculations of the cost of the Ukraine war are being kept by the Kiel University in Germany, and they have a website dedicated to that. It's very complicated to navigate through. I have to say, don't think that any of your readers will actually say, okay, let's click to that website and we'll find out. It will take you hours just to understand how it all correlates. Nevertheless, because some people have put in the hours, it appears that the actual hard weapons give out by the United States were around 120 or 130 billions. Again, as always, there's a caveat there. It is not exactly that all of these countries gave us the invoices and say, look, this is what we have transferred.
Okay, got it. All right, let's talk about Greenland. What is that all about?
Well, we're jumping from Ukraine to Greenland,
Well,
but
I think as I shared with you before we got on, the audience is pretty well versed on kind of the Ukraine stuff. And so I want you now to help us understand why you think Greenland, Mexico, Canada, the tariffs, it's almost like Trump has bigger fish to fry and he's moving on from Ukraine. Now, if you want to, I think everything does relate to Ukraine, but even in the United States, it doesn't even seem the focus is Ukraine anymore. He's not in the news anymore. Well, I guess let's talk about the press conference, actually. What were your thoughts on that when Zelensky came to the White House and he sat with Trump and JD Vance? That got a lot of coverage. Actually, let's get your opinion there.
Well, that was typical Trump. And let us not forget that there is a lot of animosity, personal animosity, both on behalf of Trump towards Zelensky, because the president actually considers Zelensky as someone who not only did not support him during these the impeachment process, but actually gave a lot of material to the investigators. So as we know, Trump does bear grudges, and this would influence the policies. Having said that, it is not just a personal grudge. It is the realization that the United States' best interests are better served by a rather friendly relationship with Russia than a friendly relationship with places like Vilnius or Warsaw or Prague or Brussels. And because after 3 years, it was becoming blatantly obvious that the West, the collective West, is going to lose, in quotation mark, this war. That because the whole of collective West had pitted itself against Russia and some others, and West was not going to win it. I think Trump did something extremely clever. He disengaged from the losing team and joined the winners. Now, how many people can actually say that they have done that?
Okay,
Last time I
okay,
remember was
that's
in the
fair.
Second World War, when the countries that were supporting the Germans, such as Hungary and Slovakia and Bulgaria, as soon as they were overrun by the Red Army, they changed sides and started fighting against the Germans then, so that they would be on the winning side. Didn't help them very much, admittedly, but at least Trump managed to avoid this before it came to a complete collapse.
Okay, that's a great statement. What's going on in Europe? Like England, I know with Keir Starmer, you've got France with Emmanuel Macron. I don't even know who's leading Germany right now. But are those European countries, are they still Team Ukraine? Like I remember after Zelensky left the United States after the White House incident, he went straight to Europe, and it's like those guys welcomed him with open arms. They were like buddy buddy again. So where does Europe feel? And really what's interesting is that's kind of the rest of NATO to an extent.
Yes, it is. And it has to do also with the general policies of Trump to, if not to abandon NATO, but certainly to create an alliance which is less based on the American influence and umbrella, and having the United States chiefly as a backstop rather than someone actively involved, and transferring the keys to the alliance to the Europeans. Now, the Europeans are in an exceedingly bad and unfortunate situation, because what happened is that initially, if you remember, 3 years ago, they were rather reluctant to follow the United States. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was in Washington that the Ukraine conflict was created and constructed. And the Europeans, because they relied on Russia for energy and because they had a number of other commercial interests, and let's face it, because they are neighboring to Russia, so if anything bad happens, they would be the first one to suffer. They were really reluctant to become so strident against Russia. And it was the Biden administration, along with the British, that sort of forced their hand. Now, very interestingly, what happened is that the Europeans so much adopted this guise of anti-Russian activism that they eventually painted themselves into a corner from which it was impossible to actually escape without causing a furor amongst their own electorates, whom that they have been telling for the last 3 years that we are fighting for freedom, we're fighting for Europe, we're fighting for democracy and all that. While Trump, with a completely new electoral victory, could reshuffle the cards and say, enough of this losing game. US is not going to win it. Might as well join the winners now and let the Europeans pick up the bill and sort things out if they can. We are cozying up with Moscow.
Okay, I got you. So do you think Trump might be, I don't know if he'll ever join BRICS, but like, do you think he's maybe gravitating toward saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to move from being so buddy buddy with NATO and England, France, Germany, all these European countries, which has been the case, for decades. And I'm going to I'm going to buddy up with Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, the BRICS nations, because that's where the commerce is. That's where the business is. Like, do you think that's his play?
I believe that it has to do more with isolationism. So the US should actually look after its own interests where it matters rather than everywhere the whole time all at once. It is this, on one hand, it is this neo-isolationism to some extent. That doesn't mean that suddenly the United States is going to disappear from the rest of the world and will confine itself to the Western Hemisphere. But he realizes that, as mentioned before, the best interests of the United States are not necessarily served by propping up either the European Union or the Eastern Europeans who have specific problems with Russia. Let us not forget, and in fact this was mentioned as such by the president himself, that Russia has the biggest real estate in the world. These were his words. And this is quite true. Don't forget that we're in the 21st century, and eventually in the next decades, what is going to happen is that we are going to start running out of natural resources, simply because there's too many of us and we have been depleting them for the previous decades and centuries. And I'm talking all kinds of resources, from not only metals and strategic rare earths and all these things that currently are making the news, but even things like fresh water or timber and things, obviously oil and gas. And there is a massive abundance in these in Russia, in Siberia, 95% of which has not even been investigated about.
Wow.
So even statistically, if you think about it, even if there was nothing, no other metals, uranium, for example, is very important as well. If there was nothing else in Siberia, statistically, there would be quite a bit now, but we know already for centuries now that there is quite a lot of things. So we extrapolate from there and we assume that they are going to end up, the Russians, they have ended up with the most expensive piece of real estate on the planet simply because of its resources. And in the final analysis, it's not good to say that, but global warming is a boon to Russia.
Okay. I don't really believe in global warming, but we'll table that to another conversation. All right, let me ask you this. What about those rare earth minerals in Ukraine? Like, is that real? Do they really have everything that it seems Trump is wanting to really get as part of this deal? The rare earth minerals that even like people like Senator Lindsey Graham has talked about. I can't stand that guy, for the record. Is that true in terms of Ukraine's resources?
Well, first of all, we need to correct the American president's knowledge of chemistry. When we talk about rare earths, that would be the family of lanthanides. So these are not extremely rare, but relatively difficult to get in high concentrations minerals, which are being used for very highly technical and technologic applications, such as batteries and magnets and lasers and this kind of thing. What's the way that the current American administration refers to rare earths is essentially rare minerals in general. And Ukraine has a lot of rare minerals. The actual rare earths, the lanthanides, are primarily located in the eastern provinces, which are not Ukraine's any longer. So yes,
Wow. Okay.
so that yes, there is quite a bit of not really rare earths, but using this expanded meaning. And the lanthanides themselves, from what one reads, are primarily in the eastern province.
Okay, got it. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen? How do you think Ukraine, Russia is going to play out? And then do you think this is coming to an end in the next few months or at the end of 2025? I'd love to get maybe your timeline thoughts, because you're probably going to be right. And then when we bring you back on again, you'll be right again.
Thank you very much. I hope so. It's not going to happen immediately. Certainly a peace treaty as such is not going to be signed this year, although I don't think that many people were expecting it. Even the ceasefire, as you have realized, is quite difficult to get. And this has obviously caused some frustration to President Trump. The main reason for that is the clarity and currently the strength of the Russian position, which entails the following. First of all, no European troops anywhere near the border. And even if they are termed as peacekeepers, as Europe now wants to portray them and is already creating the units that will go there, they will be labeled combatants and they will be treated as such. Russia has been very clear about this. Second, Ukraine should never be part of NATO. Third, there should be a demilitarized buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. If there are going to be peacekeepers there, Russia would accept contingents from the BRICS countries, from Africa, from South America, Asia, not Europeans, because most of Europe is in NATO, and essentially now with the new countries coming in, there are very few European countries that could actually send any kind of peacekeepers that are not neutral.
Got it.
Also, Russia does not want and will not want to return the provinces. There's a small caveat there, but I leave this for later. And there will be no ceasefire till these terms are accepted.
Okay. Russia's pretty damn powerful, right? Like we don't really understand maybe how strong Russia really is. I think most Americans think that, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union was cut up into so many different parts, Russia is no longer a superpower. But I really feel like they are. Like I really feel like they're pretty damn strong, right?
Russia is a superpower, but it is greatly diminished than the Soviet Union of the 80s. And of course, it has taken this, as anyone would, quite badly and has been trying to regain its position in the world. What the Russians see is that during the years, the 2 decades, more or less, 15 years of strategic inability, weakness of Russia, the West, NATO, and the United States in particular, managed to encroach into what Russia has always considered its sphere of influence. And I'm talking not about Soviet Union only, I'm talking about the last 3 centuries. And so they went, by the time they woke up, and I remind you, this was back in the 2008, Putin speaking at the Munich Security Conference at the time, saying, enough of this, we are not going to put up with any further extensions of your alliance. By the time they came up and they were alerted to this and they could do something, unfortunately, it has become a game of a tug of war. Now, as we have said at the beginning of this particular talk of ours, this could have been averted if the US administration at the time had not been so bloody minded. And I will remind you something that we had discussed last year. I had urged all your viewers and listeners to check out, on one hand, the RAND report 2019, and on the other hand, the December 2021 proposal, treaty, draft agreement, actually proposal, sent by Moscow to Washington and NATO. Primarily, of course, intended for Washington, because they know and they knew and understand that it was going to be the Americans who would actually accept or not this. That treaty, as we have said, most of it is a paragon of common sense in comparison to the madness and cruelty that ensued in the 3 years hence. Whoever reads
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I think I've talked a little bit about that, and correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, Putin sent to NATO and Washington a document that said, hey, put in writing that you are not going to let Ukraine join NATO. And I forget the head of NATO at the time, Jan Stoltenberg or Jan
Stoltenberg.
Stoltenberg. Okay, got it. He's the one who came and said, absolutely not. We're not putting anything like that in writing. And again, that seemed to me a very fair ask by Putin to simply say, we've talked about Ukraine not joining NATO. If you put that in writing, do you think if NATO and Washington, let's say they weren't, I don't know, had nefarious things they wanted to accomplish with going into this war. Let's say they used common sense and they put that in writing and they said, okay, you know what? You know what, Vlad, we're good. Ukraine's not joining NATO. Here we go. We put it in writing. We wouldn't have had a war, would we?
Absolutely. I'm 100% convinced of that. And
That's
that's
wild.
the
That's
corollary
wild.
of this is that Russia did not and does not intend to expand the war further.
Okay. You know, that's another great point. And that's something that, you know, these talking heads that, you know, try to make it all about Putin, bad, 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 evil Putin. They're saying, hey, and Zelensky says the same thing. He's like, you know, we're the only thing stopping Putin from then trying to take over Poland. And then he's going to want Germany. And then he's going to want this and he's going to want that. But that's all nonsense to me. It's actually very similar to the nonsense Netanyahu tries to say in terms of, you know, the entire Middle East considers America the big Satan and we're the little Satan and we're the ones buffering between, you know, these, you know, militant Islamics taking over America. So it's almost like that's their playbook to basically use. And I totally agree with you. All right. So anything else on the, I guess, the culmination of this before we maybe shift over to talking about Greenland and the tariffs and why you think those are also related?
Yes, of course. A couple of points there. That finally Washington realized that recapturing Ukrainian territory, definitely Crimea, but even the four provinces now, is an unrealistic objective and an illusionary goal. And these are exact quotes from the Secretary of Defense last week. And Washington also realized and understood that Russia has security concerns which are analogous to those of the United States, which would also never accept any kind of meddling in the Western Hemisphere. That is why we came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Russia's war on Ukraine, even though it cannot be legally legitimized, I'm an international lawyer and I would be the first one to say that this is illegitimate, unlawful, however you want to call it. But the concerns that motivated it can be understood and discussed. And this is what they're trying to do now. Again, remember going back to the December 2021 proposal by the Russians. And they also, what has come up to light, especially by some people looking into archives, national archives, and the press releases of the time, they actually did find out that, notwithstanding again what the common wisdom is now, the West had promised to the Russians that NATO would not expand further east after the Cold War. The big question remains why the Russians did not insist this becoming a part of a treaty on paper. It is very difficult to explain that away. My personal view is that Gorbachev at the time had so many internal problems because the Soviet Union was collapsing and he could see this, that it certainly slipped. I wouldn't say it slipped his mind, but certainly became a second or third priority, and hoping that he was first going to save the building from collapsing and then go back and say, let's sign this treaty. By that time, of course, it was all too late. Soviet Union didn't exist any longer.
Got it. Got it. Got it. You know what? You know, one last question on this, and you might not even know this, but you know, you talk about the four provinces that most likely will end up back in Russian control, and then Crimea, obviously, and those are two things that have been in the media since 2014, if not sooner. What do the people want in those areas? what do the people in those 4 provinces want? What do the people, I think the people in Crimea consider themselves Russian, so I think they want to be part of Russia, but what do the people want?
Crimea itself is a very unique case. In fact, it is an accident of history that it became Ukrainian. Everyone knows, and no one has disagreed, that during the 50s, it was, during the 60s, in fact, it was given by Khrushchev, Ukrainian Secretary General, and they just changed the borders of the internal Soviet republics. It's the equivalent of, if you want, Virginia and West Virginia that share a border. That would actually one state where you would carve a bit and give it to the other.
Okay. Okay. So
No one
Crimea's always been Russian. That's a little bit nonsense. Okay. What about those 4 provinces? I know it's like Donetsk, Luhansk, all the ones Nikki Haley had no clue where they were even on a map, but she wanted to send billions of US dollars and troops there. I digress. I like to take jabs at Nikki Haley when I can. But what about those 4? What do you think those people want?
Certainly, the majority in Donetsk and Lugansk, which we collectively call the Donbass,
Okay.
were Russian speakers and pro-Russians, and that is why there was a civil war in these 2 particular provinces ever since 2014. And Minsk agreements were actually negotiated in order to stabilize and hopefully eliminate this civil war. The other 2 provinces were not as pro-Russian as the Donbass ones, but they were not pro-Ukrainian. Remember that when we talked about it last year, I explained the significant difference of Western Ukrainians to Eastern Ukrainians. So there were definitely some people who were Ukrainian speaking and Ukrainian minded in Zaporozhia and Kherson.
Mhm.
But what happened is that they were not as vociferous against Russia. Obviously, if you had asked them at the time, do you want to be part of Russia? They would say, no, we're fine with Ukraine. And this is exactly what happened, because once the invasion took place, even Russian speakers who were in general pro-Russian, they said, well, that's a bridge too far. It's one thing to negotiate some kind of territorial exchange. It's another thing to send bombs falling on our heads. So they became much more pro-Ukrainian. Again, fully understandable. So the Donbass would have stayed, these 2 provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk, would have been a part of a federal Ukraine, as according, if the Minsk agreements had gone to their logical conclusion, the other 2 provinces would have remained Ukrainian. Now, of course, that if you take something by the force of arms after so many hundreds of thousands of casualties, you're not going to give them.
Got it. Okay, understood. Okay, all right. Let's pivot to Greenland tariffs, Mexico, Canada. Give us your thoughts and explain why that stuff is important to Trump.
Well, Trump aims to expand American influence in the Arctic, and that's why he has been talking about acquiring Greenland and Canada, seemingly unconnected with the Ukraine war, which of course he had said he would resolve within 24 hours. 50% of the Arctic region is Russian. A small, relatively small, percentage is US, north of Alaska. Canada has the other larger part, I think 38%, something like that. And Trump realizes that one of the next big gold rush, metaphorically, places is going to be the Arctic. Everyone has known that for the last 30 years. Everyone has been expecting this for the last 30 years. It's not just Trump who woke up one day and saw the sign.
And you're talking about the Arctic region. I mean, I don't even think anybody knows what that really is. So that is that Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and then part of Russia, like basically
Yes.
everything before we get to the North Pole.
The North Pole has the Arctic Ocean around it, and there is no land mass. The closest land masses are the north of Greenland and the north of Canada. And then beyond that, the north of Alaska, Spitsbergen, and a number of islands, most of them belonging to Russia, mostly uninhabited, and also Russian mainland part jutting out. Obviously, when they're talking, at least for now, with our technical capacities, when they're talking about exploiting the Arctic, I do not think that they mean somehow drilling in the Arctic Ocean or mining in the Arctic ice shelf, beneath the Arctic ice shelf. I believe they're talking about being able both to exploit the resources that are abundant in Greenland, northern Canada, and obviously the northern part of Russia, plus the northern sea route that the US would want to explore, which would actually lead from the US west coast or Alaska, if you want. But let's say the west coast, because Alaska would just be a stop there. And then up the Bering Strait, and then all over the northern part of Eurasia. And then where have you arrived? In Western Europe. Brilliant. Can you imagine how much cheaper that is? Plus, you don't really need to go any longer through the Panama Canal, which perhaps the Chinese are.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. So you're talking, really, you're saying that fundamentally the entire situation, I mean, everything with Trump is business to me. I mean, not everything, but like I do think he looks at everything from a highly business perspective. And so is that what's driving the talk about Greenland? Like he thinks it's a strategic resource for some of maybe the raw minerals or natural resources, and then at the same time, shipping routes?
Yes, the shipping routes are secondary, the resources are primary, and another, not necessarily said loudly, but primary issue is simple geopolitics, geostrategic conquest or influence, I should say, because Trump, yes, business oriented, and that's where the raw materials interest comes from, but also has a quite good understanding, it seems, of geopolitics, and knows that the next, as we mentioned before, the next big gold rush is going to be in the Arctic. So the more of the Arctic that United States holds, the better the chances are of influence in general. Russia's Arctic is not going anywhere away soon. They will keep it. But let us not forget that Denmark and Canada, two countries that have actually have aroused the ire of the American president, have been too debonair about their northern parts. I mean, there is right now in Greenland, think about it, there's 50,000 people. In Cambridge, England, where I live, which is a small town, there's 4 times, 5 times this. It's a tiny place with a huge, huge expanse. The northern islands of Canada are exactly the same. And none of these two countries ever wanted to exploit them. For ideological reasons, they have wanted to essentially hand them back to their native inhabitants, of which I said there's only a few tens of thousands. And Trump has been thinking, what a wasted opportunity, just creating two, nations, absolutely tiny in population, bearing this massive, massive pie of resources, influence, and geostrategy. No, we should get there first. So that's the real reason.
Okay, so that's Greenland. All right, let's talk about the tariffs. What are your thoughts on obviously how brash he's been especially tariffs in regards to Canada and Mexico. My understanding, and when I look back on even Reagan and what he talked about with tariffs and all that, I mean, they do fundamentally work. And I do agree and believe in, fair trade and equality. And I think the United States has been taken advantage of in that regard. I guess the question is, can't you get the same result by just sort of saying, hey, everybody, here's what's going on. It's not fair right now between Canada and Mexico. We're going to give them an opportunity to correct it. And if they don't, we're going to drop the hammer. I think with Trump, he drops the hammer first, or at least he makes the big rhetoric about dropping the hammer. And then maybe, he wants that noise to create the controversy, but he knows he's not going to, implement it as drastically. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Exactly like yours. It's a lot of chest thumping there.
Yeah.
And that he hopes that is going to create a better deal for USA than has been the case so far. Let us not forget that for the last, 30 years, that's NAFTA has been in 20 years plus. Obviously, trade for the United States, but it seems that it was actually more helpful first for Mexico, two for Canada. There have been definite benefits for US, but they have come along with some negative issues, such as increased immigration.
Mm.
There has not been much increased immigration towards Mexico because of NAFTA. So Trump puts these on the scales and says, you know what? We really need to renegotiate certain things.
Yeah.
Same with the Europeans. And let us not forget the main thing and the main reason, from what I understand, that the current administration, the Republicans, were elected were because of their promise to make America a more livable place itself, not make it great again in the world, as in we're going to conquer the whole world. That may or may not be there. We'll see. But definitely should bring down the price of eggs. It should make the life of people cheaper. It should provide much more work. And the best way to provide work in a place like the United States, where you had a massive industrial capacity 50 and 80 years ago, and now it is much reduced, is to raise such tariffs to the third countries that are exporting to you, so that you would make your own products competitive after 40 years that they have not.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, fundamentally, that makes sense. I love what you said about Trump's a lot of chest thumping and making the noise, but that's not really how he's going about it. I think that is absolutely accurate. The other thing I've noticed is you see all these big announcements where Apple has committed to invest $500 billion. Samsung is committed to invest $200 billion. The Saudis have committed $800 billion. I don't think Saudis committed. Actually, they might have said that. Now, the interesting thing with all of those announcements, I kind of think those are also chest thumping. And I'll tell you why. All of them, they say over the next 4 years. So they're basically giving themselves a 4-year runway, because if the American people don't like what has happened in the next 4 years, they're going to vote Democrat again. So they're giving themselves that 4-year runway. And like you said perfectly, using Apple as the perfect analogy, is Apple really going to bring their manufacturing from China, which I think is still the predominant place they manufacture all of our Apple products? Are they ever going to bring that back to the United States? I don't think they will. I really don't.
There are economics there, and there's also geopolitics and international relations. And this Apple in China that you just mentioned does relate to the Ukraine issue and the Ukraine war, because what the Ukraine war managed to do is to to alienate Russia completely from the West, from Europe. You see, Europe, it wants to continue the war against Russia. I mean, whatever next without the United States.
Yeah.
We're talking about fools here. But
Yeah.
he realized that, well, we have really sent Russia volens nolens in the hands of the Chinese. Of course, this was to be expected. And now they are much cozier than they have ever been before. Mind you, geopolitically, China and Russia are natural enemies because they share the same Eurasian, Asian for China space. And China has a massive population, or is overpopulated, and Russia, the largest real estate in the world, is underpopulated.
Got it.
This is something that the Russians have been acutely aware. In fact, there have been many wars which have been fought between Russia and China in the last 200 years. China invariably ceding lands to Russia, hence Russia goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, you don't hear much of it, but there is a tiny bit of irredentism there also from the Chinese saying, well, many of these lands were originally Chinese, we should take them. So, cut the long story short, there are endless conflicting possibilities between Russia and China in the medium to long term. Not right now, because they both had a common enemy, the United States. And as we said before, the Republicans realized that China, and that's the Democrats thought exactly the same, China is the main enemy. It beats me. Why, if the Democrats thought exactly that, why did they create this war? Why did they construct this war, as we said at the beginning, since it was not that they were not thinking about China. Biden himself was saying, yes, the Chinese are the primary threat. Fine. If this is the primary threat, why are you actually making the only country that can destroy you, and that's Russia, it's not China, go into China's arms? Why?
That's a great point. So you're saying the Democrats talked about China being the enemy, but basically by supporting the Ukrainian war, it's driven Russia into China's arms. And you've got Putin and Xi Jinping cheersing vodka together while they
Exactly.
have their sushi.
And Trump, nothing to do here with any commercial aspirations. Trump
Gotcha.
realized that, this is really wrong. We also agree. My administration sees China as the main enemy, but what we have been doing so far is making our enemy stronger and stronger. It is not that we have made friends of China places like Syria or Venezuela or Iran. We have put the Russian Federation into their hands. As I said, the only country in the world that can actually destroy the United States.
Got it.
How clever was that?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. All right, listen, Professor Floudas, this has been fantastic. I have to start getting you on more often. You're going to have to carve out more time, because I would like to do a specific episode, if you're up for it, on the whole Serbia, Kosovo bombing of Belgrade, and then the country of Yugoslavia. I know that country doesn't even exist anymore. I don't know anything about Yugoslavia. So think about other maybe big geopolitical things over the past 40 or 50 years that we could take topic by topic, because I think you can add such value to my listeners' base of understanding, kind of topic by topic. So if that works for you, we can maybe set something up.
It would be my pleasure, and there's a number of topics that we can talk about if your audience is interested, and I will send you a list.
Okay, perfect. You know what? Maybe I'll get your list. I'll survey everybody and I'll say, hey, what do you want? What do you want Professor Floudas to talk about next? And then we'll go from there. All right, listen, everybody. I hope you guys enjoy Professor Demetrius Floudas as much as I do. I really do. I'm telling you, I listen to you. I listen to Professor John Mearsheimer, and I listen to Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Those are my three professors that are on my speed dial in terms of listening to. So you're in very good company there.
You're far too kind. Putting me at the same level and group like Mearsheimer and Sachs is something I certainly do not reserve, but I take it as a heartfelt compliment nonetheless.
It absolutely is a huge
however unworthy I may be of that.
All right. Well, listen, hang on the line. All right, everybody, keep calling a spade, and we'll have Professor Floudas back on.
Thank you very much.
This episode was brought to you by the new book, Deep Shallow Dive Into You, available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble in hardcover and paperback. Don't forget to sign up for our new mailing list on our website at deepshallowdive.com.